All right, we're live. Welcome back to the Engineer Disaster Talk. This is episode 003, Agents of Chaos. Please hit the like button as you come in, share the video if possible, and hit that notification bell so you get all the updates from Engineer Disaster Talk. So today's topic, what are we talking about here? Agents of Chaos. In the wake of all of the protests and all of the calamity that's going on in Western society, who's behind what? Okay, who's financing what? Who's pushing what agenda? We want to have a conversation about that. While I wait for my co-host to come on, Martha, we definitely will get in more into that further into the podcast. And so what has happened here is that an explosion of demonstrations and protests over the last few months since May have turned out, even before May, but the most prominent protests have come out in May. And so what does that mean from a high level? Demonstrations are normal. Political upheaval, dissatisfaction, that's pretty normal. But what happens when you have funding involved in some of these organizations on the ground in protests? Who's behind it? Okay. The objective with this discussion is just to have information dissemination on some of the workings, the inner workings that may be going on that should be challenged. Okay, should be challenged. Now, going back to 2016, there's been a lot of rumors about who's funding what and so on and so forth. More prominent names, such as George Soros. It's a name that's been tossed out there over the last few years, if not longer, in terms of demonstrations that have gone on in terms of in terms of injustice and who's paying for that. Well, his name, Soros, has been put out there. You ask anybody on the street, they may not know what he looks like, but they always seem to know that name, Soros. And so, who's really behind this? Is it really Soros? Some people push back and say, well, that's just a rumor. Then other people come back and say, well, yeah, this is true. So who's right and who's wrong in all of this is what we're trying to find out today. And while I bring on my co-host, we'll hear what she has to say as well. Martha, can you hear us? You can unmute your mic, Martha. While we wait for Martha to get her mic situation put together, we want to also talk, about the connections with different groups and different organizations and what the impact is overall in these sort of protests. And so, what started off as Hands Up, Don't Shoot in 2014 of the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, now turned into BLM, or Black Lives Matter. And the question has always circled around as to who is this group and what are they doing? People like the slogan. Some people push back and say, well, all lives matter. That's not our concern here. Our concern here is who are the people and what kind of connections are with this. Anyone can join the movement and wait for my co-host to come on. Anyone could be a part of a movement and claim anything, but we have to know um, where did all this start and where did it all come from, and how did it gain the momentum that it does have today? That's very much a question here. Martha, can you hear us? We'll give Martha a few seconds to get her mic situation put back together. But and so that's what we're talking about today. That's what we're talking about today. Let me bring up the charter for Black Lives Matter. Share my screen and so you all can see what I'm seeing for those who are sighted. So it says Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Black Lives Matter Foundation Incorporated is a global organization in the US, UK, and Canada whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes, by combating and countering acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation. In centering Black joy, we are winning immediate improvements in our lives. Okay. Martha, can you hear us? We'll give Martha a few minutes to get her situation together. And so I want to finish reading this as well. We are expansive. We are a collective of liberators who believe in the inclusive and spacious movement. We also believe that in order to win and bring as many people with us along the way, we must move beyond the narrow nationalism that is all too prevalent in Black communities. We must ensure we are building a movement that brings all of us into the front, We affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, undocumented folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. Our network centers those who have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. Let's see, Martha, can you hear us? If you can, unmute your microphone.
Hello, can you hear me now, Mike?
I can hear you now.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, good. I've been having all, problems coming in because my microphone was off.
Yep.
Hold on a minute.
Yep.
My microphone, are you able to still hear me? I put the phone down.
I can hear you.
Okay, I put the phone down and I didn't get to hear too much about what you said because I was fighting with Zoom as usual.
Yep.
Hold on. Okay, so I'm sorry. Can you recap a little bit about what you were talking about, because I was still trying to log on.
Yeah, I just kind of went over the high level of what we're talking about today. Who's connected with the movement for Black Lives, as well as going over just the about page for Black Lives Matter. And then what I wanted to do was kind of get your input as to what your thoughts are based on some of the information that you have read.
Well, I saw an article by a source that I don't generally, to be honest with you, I don't really generally trust, not because I would have reasons, not because he would not have data, he may or may not, but because his perspective is different, and he does have a sort of axe to grind against the George Floyd protest. But he did cover some stuff that I've seen even on the page for, there's a page called it's called Popular Democracy, and they talked about how George Soros had offered the Black Lives Matter organization, to fund it. And unfortunately, I did not see, as I have not been able to see whether any funding, any money changed hands. I know that Engdahl has talked about, to begin with, he wrote an article for New Eastern article on June 16th, where he essentially talks about the George Floyd protest in general as being a part of a colored revolution directed against the US. He is, just to explain who he is described as a strategic risk consultant and lecturer with a degree in politics in Princeton University and a best-selling author on oil and geopolitics. So he says that the violence that has occurred in the protests have been engineered by trained actors, he claims, and he associates Black Lives Matter. And again, he makes this ridiculous assumption that Antifa is an organization. He associates the two groups as being primarily responsible for the protests in these protests. Now, his sources are a Washington Times article written by Valerie Richardson that was published on August 16th of 2016, and an article by James Simpson for a think tank called Capital Research that was written on September 21st of 2016. According to him and his sources, this so-called left-driven colored revolution, which is, I'll get to that later because it just doesn't make any sense, has been financed by tax-exempt foundations like Ford, the George Soros Open Society Foundation, the Kellogg's Foundation, and even Hewlett-Packard. He claims that organizations that Black Lives Matter leaders, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors, organizations that they were associated with before, were recipients of this money. That they received money from these foundations, like the Right to the City Alliance, which is an anti-gentrification organization, which supposedly got $6.5 million between 2011 and 2014 from foundations that include the Ford Foundation, which gave them 1.9 million, the George Soros Open Society Foundation and the Foundation to Promote Open Societies, both belonging to George Soros, which gave them 1.3 million. The Kellogg Foundation gave them $250,000. Ben and Jerry's $30,000. And now he also says that Laura Garza also got money from some of these foundations as executive direction of an organization called Power, which is people organized to win employment rights. And Alicia also shared the Right to the City Alliance, which allegedly received 1.3 million from Ford Foundation. The thing that, and he eventually states that, by the way, all of these organizations were supposed to be front organizations for something called the Freedom Road Socialist Organizations. These are organizations that he claims that these people used to belong to before the Black Lives Matter organization was founded, which was right around the time that Trayvon Martin was killed. I don't know, I have not seen the original sources that either he or the Washington Times or or Capital Research have seen. However, I think that this would be a good time to caution people that are doing, organizers, as, that are trying their hand at organizing, that the last thing that you want to do, whether this is true or not, the last thing that you want to do is take money from foundations like this. First of all, because whoever controls the purse strings is ultimately going to control the message. And not only are they going to control the message, they're going to control what things you demand, how you're going to go about achieving your goals, etc. So I would really caution people against taking money from foundations like this. You take an organization like Ford. Ford Foundation has benefited from the oil and other resources that the United States and Europe have extracted from Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. And those are regions where they are carrying out wars, not because they're concerned about which government runs X country, but because they want to make sure that whoever is in control of those countries makes the resources of those countries available to their multinational corporations. So when an organization like that offers you money, you really need to get the hell away from them and stay as far away from them as possible.
So let me jump in here real quick and actually I had an article actually came to me just before the live stream from Open Society for Foundations.org. And right here, I'm sharing my screen with it right in front of me, Martha. I'll send it to you as well. Open Society, this is from July 13, 2020. Open Society Foundations announced $220 million for building power in Black communities. Open Society Foundations is a George Soros group, okay?
And they've been behind the coup in Ukraine that has plunged that has plunged that country to this date still into civil war. I'm sure that he's behind the attempts to overthrow Venezuela. By the way, are you familiar with the Borealis Charity Fund? Because they just created a fund back in 2016. They announced it. It's called the Black-Led Movement Fund. And this was created, by the Ford Foundation, by Kellogg, and other corporations, foundations like that. And the purpose of that fund is to provide technical support as well as grants to organizations that are promoting leadership of young Black women and queer and trans organizations and immigrant organizations. The fact that anybody would want to support these organizations is not the problem. I mean, it's not that. The problem is when they do support them, what kind of impact are they going to have on their message? What kind of impact are they going to have on their tactical decisions, on their strategies as to what they'll be supporting or not supporting? Who is to say that somewhere along the line, these organizations won't be used as destabilization NGOs for destabilizing other countries abroad?
So let me read this excerpt from the Open Society Foundation's note on July 13th. This was last week. To support New York, to support this nation's historic movement towards racial justice, the Open Society Foundation today is announcing investments totaling $220 million in emerging organizations and leaders building power in Black communities across the country, placing a bet on their ability to carry today's momentum toward a better tomorrow. The largest share of this support, $150 million, will be through a set of 5-year grants to Black-led organizations that help to create and now sustain the momentum towards racial equality. Open Society's response reflects our conviction that real progress requires sustained support over many years in letting leaders accountable to impact the communities shaped the pathway. It is inspiring and powerful to experience this transformational moment in the racial justice movement, said Open Society's Foundation President Patrick Gaspard. We are honored to be able to carry on the vital work of fighting for rights, dignity, and equity for oppressed people the world over, started by our founders and chair, George Soros. So if there was any doubt that Soros was involved in the funding of BLM, this is from July 13th, 2020.
Wow. And the ironic thing about that is that when you look at the Ukraine, for instance, where not only he was involved in creating a coup against an elected government there, but it turns out that the Ukraine is the place where a lot of the right-wing armed militias, white militias in the United States go to get training so that they can come back, or in this case, go to the United States and terrorize Black people and other people of color. And this this horrific situation was brought to you by the same person who is now funding Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely. And for those who think that this is an incredible source, this is straight from Open Society Foundation. So it's not from a questionable news source. This is straight from the source itself, which is Open Society Foundation, and $220 million for building power in Black communities. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money that is being spent here. And so when we talk about who's behind and who's connected to the organizations on the ground, now you know where the money is coming from. Okay, it may have been grassroots at one point, but it no longer is now. And so you bring up the Borrellas Group. They basically operate as consultants, would you say?
Yes, yes. And the technical training comes from them. What kind of technical training is that?
Yes.
And does it involve talking points? Does it,
maybe press releases,
Exactly.
maybe silkscreen T-shirts, placards,
Yeah,
bumper stickers, maybe.
exactly.
And so if you go down even further, the Borellis group also partnered with the movement strategy for Center in Oakland, which is basically the other Black Lives Matter chapter, right? And the Open Society Foundations also partner with the Center for American Progress. So why is the Center for American Progress important?
Isn't that a Democratic front? Democratic Party front?
They are a Democratic Party front, but who was the head of the Center for American Progress? The one and only John Podesta. Mr. John Podesta with his emails that were compromised and were blamed on WikiLeaks.
Mm-hmm.
How you got Pizzagate, which Pizzagate led to questionable activities in Haiti.
Yeah.
Okay. Child trafficking happened in Haiti under the guise of John Podesta and his brother. And so are we saying that we're not saying anything other than this is the information that's on the table. This is publicly available information.
And just to be sure, we're not saying that the entire protests are the product of, I mean, I think the protests are legitimate. They're most definitely legitimate. The entire protests are not the product of George Soros, as William Engel and his ilk would have us believe. But we have to be careful with people who are clearly waiting in the wings to figure out how they can co-opt these protests and use them for, let's say, support the Democratic Party in this upcoming elections. In fact, there's a coalition that Black Lives Matter is supposed to be a part of that is called the
Movement for Black Lives?
Movement for Black Lives Coalition. Mm-hmm. And when you donate to them, the source that collects the donations and funnels them to Black Lives Matter and all of the different organizations who are part of that coalition mm-hmm. is the Act Blue charity. And if I'm not mistaken, the Act Blue charity also is the source of money funneling for the Joe Biden campaign.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the connections for Central American Progress, left-leaning again, Act Blue, left-leaning again, the movement strategy centered in Oakland, California, left-leaning again.
Although I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
They say that they're left-leaning, but they're really not. Like when you consider what they're doing, these are, Center for American Progress. The people that are in the Center for American Progress are also behind, to the extent that they belong to the Democratic Party and that some of them were part of the Obama administration. They are part of the efforts, have been part of the efforts to get rid of a left government in Venezuela. And they were also involved in creating NGOs and land partitioning movements in Bolivia to overthrow the elected government of Evo Morales, again, a left-leaning country. So my sense is this, I don't know what you think about it, but my sense is what these organizations have done has been to co-opt the talking points and the symbols are organizations that have been considered, the left, that in the 60s and 70s, fought for for Black liberation, for the right of self-determination for people around the world, and they're using those same symbols and those same talking points to do the opposite of what they were meant to do in the first place, when they were embraced by people that were involved in movements for justice back then.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. I mean, like I said, there's so many moving pieces, so many different connections, and so much money being thrown around. I mean, 220 million from the Open Society is just what we're seeing right now as of this week. Adidas actually gave 500,000 last month to BLM, $500,000,
Lovely.
another $500,000.
And didn't BLM, when they had, the debates for the Democratic Party, didn't Alicia Garza endorse Elizabeth Warren for president?
Yes. And so, let me go back to BLM's page. They consider themselves, Black Lives Matter Incorporated is a global organization in the US,
Jesus.
UK, and Canada. Okay, this is their mission statement. A global organization. And so what we're seeing here is multinational now. Okay, they're multinational. What does that mean as a whole? That what you have is funding, a lot of funding, a lot of quote unquote left leaning, and it's multinational.
And why would you need to become a global organization if you're a grassroots organization? I mean, the Panthers had solidarity relations with many movements around the world, especially in Africa and Vietnam, and they didn't become a global organization for that. They simply established relations with the people that were on the ground, fighting for, against white supremacy in Africa, and befriending them and supporting them. They were contacting, the National Liberation Movement in Vietnam and befriending them. They didn't have to become a multi-million-dollar, global organization for that. And what are they doing with their globality? Are they protesting the destruction of Yemen right now, which is being bombed by Saudi Arabia at the behest of the United States?
No. And even okay, so you had funding back then in the 60s and 70s for the Panther movement. Okay, you had Harry Belafonte, you had Bill Cosby, you had many celebrities who funded it, but there were no top-down organizations, foundations that did things like that, to my knowledge. If anybody knows.
There were no. It had no corporate funding whatsoever. I remember I was a, I was a teenager back then, and I remember hearing about the Black Panthers, and they had some actors and actresses that funded their breakfast program, but you didn't have Kellogg's or Ford. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe Kellogg's was going to donate some boxes of cereals or something. I don't know, but maybe some milk might be involved in that. But the thing is, the difference between the Panthers and BLM today is that they didn't have $200+ million. Everything that they did was grassroots. Okay, it was built. A lot of the policy-driven initiatives were grassroots. Okay, the
Mhm.
reason why you have a first aid urgent care clinics is because of the Panther Party. Okay,
Yeah.
why you have breakfast programs and so on and so forth is because of the Panther Party. Okay, Fred Hampton was very instrumental in all of that. As young as he was below 25. Okay? He was younger than 25 at the time, and so it shows you the power of young people at that time in the thought process, who did not rely on handouts, so to speak, but did get support from your Black and brown celebrities. But they also, like you said before, they work with the berets, as well as many different Black student unions and so on and so forth. Actually, the Panthers came out of the Black student unions, if I remember correctly. So
Yeah. Yeah, and they also worked with the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican pro-independence organization made up of Puerto Ricans raised in the United States.
mm-hmm.
So again, and quite the contrary, organizations like Ford and like Kellogg and whoever the incarnation of George Soros would have been back then, would have, wanted the head of the Panthers on the chopping block. And they wanted that because they knew that they couldn't co-opt them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's what we're talking about here. Agents of chaos. Who are these people? Who's behind the curtain? Who's pulling the strings? Who's funding what? Who's connected to what? We're not questioning the legitimacy of anybody, but we're just calling out what's publicly available. You have anything else you want to add, Arthur?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to this business of them supporting Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren has never pronounced herself, has never acted against the United States' constant wars in Africa. I mean, they have destroyed Somalia, leaving them with only whatever seafood they can scrounge around their territorial waters is the only source of food for them. And that has been the result of the U.S. aggressions against that country. She's never pronounced herself against what's going on in Yemen. Yemen is, these are African people. Hello. And so, and not only are they bombing them within an inch of their lives, but U.S. troops are literally surrounding the country's territorial waters and occupying their airspace to make sure that medicines and other things that they clearly need, given the destruction of their infrastructure, could get to them. But the other thing is, Elizabeth Warren has been quite vocal in support of the US coup in Venezuela, which is an atrocity and a travesty, because the US coup in Venezuela not only intends to cancel out the electoral mandate of the Venezuelan people, but and not only is it intended, so that the United States can steal the oil and the gold and the other, natural resource wealth of Venezuela, but this is a coup that is essentially against Black people and indigenous people. The elites that want to topple President Maduro and the Bolivarian government is essentially a white elite. This is what Elizabeth, I like to pretend I'm indigenous, so that I can appeal to people. This is what she wants. This is what she is supporting. She is supporting essentially a coup against people of color. And my question to Alicia Garza and the Black Lives Matter movement would be, if you are against the oppression of people of color in the United States, if you are against them being kept out of the loop of the wealth that they built, of the wealth their ancestors built, If you are against that, if you're against the brutalization of people of color by police, why would you support someone that supports that very thing abroad?
I'm sorry, my mic was muted. Exactly, and what I have in front of me right now is the Borealis philanthropy page for Black-led Movement Fund. Let me just read the background real quick. The movement for Black Lives, born out of the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, has become a powerful dynamic constellation of leaders and groups that have come together to tackle a variety of interconnected problems. The individuals of the movement are young Black, queer, trans, feminist, immigrant, and undocumented leaders who are embracing grassroots organizing as a core strategy to educate and mobilize people to address state violence and injustice in Black communities. For generations, Black-led social justice institutions have been under-resourced and their leaders have not received adequate support. As a new generation of leaders shapes the conversation about race, criminalization, and state and gender violence in the United States, the Black-led Movement Fund aims to transform this scenario by supporting intersectional Black-led organizing and their leaders as they build and activate bases of power in local communities. Okay. Let me just read the grant model and funding priorities. The BLMF provides general operating support grants, organizational development support, and movement building resources organizations involved in the movement for Black lives. The BLMF supports organizations working to advance the vision of young Black, queer, feminist, and immigrant leaders. In particular, we prioritize funding organizations who are actively leading and anchoring the movement for Black lives. So this is a fiduciary, philanthropy fiduciary, I guess, for BLM. And so if this isn't an NGO, I don't know what it is.
And what is the purpose of hurling? I don't care what their stated purpose is what do they want to achieve from throwing all these millions of dollars? More
funding. One for me, two for you.
And that brings up another point. On June 5th, the National Endowment for Democracy issued a statement about how they endorsed the George Floyd protest and how they claimed that the struggle for justice in the United States would inspire people all over the world to challenge the status quo. Mm-hmm. The National Endowment for Democracy, the people who get rid of governments, that set up public health care programs for people and public education, college and otherwise for people, and impose neoliberal governments that privatize everything, up to and including the ground you're going to lie on when you die. This is the organization that is supposedly endorsing the George Floyd protest. And this is why I'm concerned about what is the purpose of all this money being thrown at these organizations.
Yes, there's a lot of money. It's a lot of, you can build a lot of infrastructure with that. $300 million in somewhere like Puerto Rico, you could actually build a lot of electrical utility infrastructure there.
Yeah, and you can, the next time that there's an Aristide in Haiti, right? You can use an organization like that to go and topple a progressive government like that under some human rights or racism related excuse.
Their budget for BLM is bigger than most military budgets in Africa or in the Caribbean for that matter. Okay, they have a larger endowment than most of your Caribbean countries that have a military defense budget?
Well, the Borealis Foundation back in 2016 had initiated a 6-year campaign to raise $100 million.
That's a lot of money.
And again, and you know, when you consider, right, that even Martin Luther King, who is, you know, who is now, after he's dead, of course, endorsed by everybody in the US establishment because he was nonviolent and so, but that's not how they treated him when he was alive.
No.
When he was alive, you know, the FBI was sending him memos, urging him to commit suicide, right? And threatening, you know, to unveil some supposed personal stuff they knew about him. You know, if he didn't do that. Back then, you had the corporate media calling him a communist.
Absolutely.
And so, but so Martin Luther King, and I find it very interesting, by the by, that he was killed as soon as he started criticizing the US war in Vietnam and referring to the US government as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And so you had a state, and you had a corporate media, and you had a corporate structure that went after practically everybody, some right away and some later, you know, but that went after Fred Hampton, killed them, demonized them, demonized Martin Luther King for a pretty long time before they looked like they accepted him for a little bit. And actually, and so they didn't throw millions of dollars at Martin Luther King. They didn't throw millions of dollars at Malcolm X. No, they killed Malcolm X.
In fact, they both died broke.
Yes.
And they both died below the age of 40. Okay, Fred Hampton died, but you know, just
Fred Hampton was what, 25? He was like very, very young.
Yeah, I think he started off when he was about 17 with the Panthers. And so
yeah,
he's a very prominent voice and up and coming. And so most of these people died broke. They did not have any money. With some of these new sort of social justice advocates, activists, what you're seeing now is potentially 6-figure salaries, you know, for protesting and you know, activists. You know, it's very it's a lucrative career now.
Yeah.
You have anything else you want to share with us?
No, no, not at this particular. Oh, well, I just had a couple of tidbits that I found very interesting on that announcement of the NED intending to use the protests to weaponize them for, you know, quote unquote regime change elsewhere. I found it interesting that right around the time that that they made their statement, Joshua Wong of the so-called Hong Kong democracy movement made some kind of a lukewarm statement about how he supported the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Now I'm talking about the demonstrations, not, you know, Black Lives Matter Inc., you know, the demonstrations that are totally legitimate. But what's interesting is that I think that that was part of an attempt to conflate, you know, the Hong Kong movement, which is nothing but an operation on the part of the United States to destabilize China and to partition its territory so that they can use that, you know, what Hong Kong then to create a military base to be at China's throat, by the by. Yes. So he made a statement like that. But what's interesting is that he never criticized Donald Trump for his response to the anti-police brutality protest. And the rest of the Hong Kong movement doesn't really feel that way. In fact, Jimmy Lai, I believe his name is. He's a media tycoon and he's the backer of the Hong Kong movement. He made statements condemning the protest, and there was a, an article that appeared on the Gray Zone Project by Ajit Singh that talked about how an African-American woman tried to organize the Black Lives Matter demonstration in Hong Kong. And she was derailed from it by the very so-called democracy movement there. And they called her a cop and an agent of the Chinese Communist Party. So there, I mean, you know, Ned is gonna have a really hard time conflating movements like that, movements like the opposition in Venezuela, which is racist, which has set Black people on fire in their anti-government protests, right? Conflating them with what's going on in the United States against police brutality. Mm-hmm. So lots of luck, because they're gonna need it. But that's pretty much all I had.
No, this is great. And I think that we covered a lot of ground on this. We spent some time actually verifying our sources, and if anybody has any questions about the citations, we'll provide them to you in the description beneath the video.
Yes, I have the articles that I've read for this that I can, again, you know, you know, like the stuff that I cited by Engdahl, you know, I have issues with him, not only because he's against the protest, but also because this business of the colored revolutions, it doesn't make any sense. Colored revolutions are what the CIA, you know, are the destabilization policies that the CIA carries out all around the world to destabilize governments that get in the way of the US stealing the resources from other countries. So why would the government, any portion of the government in the United States, you know, create a colored revolution against itself? And if it's a question that there's, you know, that there's been occasional violence at the demonstration, first of all, you know, after centuries of impunity, you know, for state brutality, for the state in its brutality against Black people, and even white civilian brutality against white people that has gone, you know, without any consequences, you can't expect that some people aren't going to respond in a violent manner to that. When you see day in and day out that they kill people, that they, you know, maim people, and nothing happens to the cops or to the white people who do this. And so some of that is to be expected. And again, most of the violence anyway was directed at demonstrators by police. You know, we all saw, well, sighted people saw, you know, cops using their cars to run over people in New York and in other parts of the United States, you know, and even some of the destruction of property was carried out by police agent provocateurs. So,
well, we saw the same thing in the Arab Spring in Egypt and Tunisia, where you had these first responder vehicles being used as battering rams against the people. Yeah. We also saw that in Ukraine in 2014, where you had people in the street being bludgeoned by what would be state officials, but they were not state officials.
No.
Victoria Nuland was out there giving out cookies.
Yes.
Victoria Nuland, a part of the State Department. What is the State Department? The State Department is an intelligence operation beyond the CIA. Okay, CIA is called threat intelligence, and State Department is their own intelligence wing within the United States government. So there are multiple agencies and departments and involved in these sort of movements, and we have to be mindful that not every movement is going to be 100% genuine. If you look at the founding of BLM, it says in 2013, but if you look at the Borealis group, started in 2014 in the movement for Black Lives Fund that was started in 2016. So we see sort of consistent dates of development happening in real time over the course of this duration. But
and we have to be careful with this because again, it's essentially, you know, they're stealing the talking points. You know, the U.S. state, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, and its public, you know, it's NGOs and foundations, you know, are essentially stealing the talking points of many genuine movements for justice and using them to promote something, you know, a lot more sinister and toxic to the very people that they claim to want to help.
But that's all I have. I think we've covered everything, and I think we can close out.
Sorry about the mishap coming in. My microphone had been turned off in settings, and I didn't realize it until I tried to log in.
Nope, that's quite fine. I think we've covered everything we need to cover. So thank you all for joining us. Please hit the like button if you have not already done so, and share the video if possible, and leave us some feedback in the comment section after the live stream is over and when you listen to the replay. Thank you, Martha, for joining us as well and being the co-host, and peace and shalom.
Okay.
Adios.